This is the story of a lonely man who had no intention of becoming anyone's savior. He lived in the quiet Texas hill country, ranching like his father and his father's father, with only the wind for company. And this is also the story of a girl who never expected to survive. When a spring mudslide swallowed half the hill, taking houses and lives, he found her. She was small, half-conscious, buried under what used to be a home. She clutched a dead dog, a piece of something she wouldn't let go of. What happened after? The silence, the slow blossoming of flowers, the porch that slowly filled with life, no one in the county saw coming. Please subscribe to Quiet Rancher Stories and click the like button so this story can reach more people who believe in second chances and quiet kindness. Rhett Marlowe, at 42, had spent nearly a decade living alone on his ranch in the sprawling Texas hill country. He was a man made of quiet habits, of early mornings, and the predictable rhythm of cattle. His wife had been gone for 9 years, taken by a fever that left a silence in the house too vast for any man to fill. He'd buried her under the big oak near the creek, then he'd just kept working. The land, at least, never talked back. That spring, the clouds piled up earlier than usual, thick and bruised purple over the ridges. Rhett watched them as he mended a section of fence near the south pasture, the hammer blows echoing flat against the looming sky. He'd seen storms before, plenty of them. This was just another spring soaking, he figured, a good wash for the dust. He pulled his hat lower and kept working, the first heavy drops splattering on his oilskin coat. But the rain didn't move on. It just kept coming, a solid sheet that hammered the tin roof of his cabin and turned the dirt roads into red rivers. The creeks, usually low and murmuring, swelled into muddy torrents. The very ground seemed to groan, a deep, unsettling rumble that vibrated through the soles of his boots. He found himself standing by the window more often than not, watching the constant downpour, a knot tightening in his stomach. It wasn't just rain now, the land itself was shifting under the weight of it. By morning, the western ridge, usually a solid green hump against the sky, had collapsed, a whole chunk of it, as if scooped out by some giant hand. A small homestead, barely visible from his ranch, had simply vanished under the mud. Rhett cinched his saddle tighter on his bay, thinking only of the cattle trail that snaked along the base of that ridge. If the trail was gone, his herds would be cut off from summer grazing. He spurred the horse, riding hard through the slick red mud, scanning the familiar landscape for signs of impassable terrain. He saw the collapsed roof of what had been a barn first, then the jumbled wreckage of a house. It was just a mound of splintered wood and red earth, barely recognizable. He circled wide, trying to see the extent of the damage, and then, sticking out from the mud near what used to be the front steps, he saw a hand, small, pale, a girl's hand, barely visible. He dismounted quickly, sinking to his knees in the muck. She was barely breathing, buried to her chest. He called out, but there was no answer. No one else moved in the ruined place. Just the girl, half gone, clutching something to her chest. The girl was young, maybe 17. Her face was smudged with wet soil, dark hair plastered to her forehead. She lay on her side, half submerged in the thick red mud, her breathing shallow and ragged. In her arms, clutched tight against her chest, was a small wire-haired terrier, utterly lifeless. Its fur was caked with mud, its eyes closed. She seemed to be holding onto it like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to the world. Rhett pulled off his oilskin coat, shaking the excess mud from it, then gently wrapped it around her shoulders. Her skin was cold, clammy. He tried to get her to let go of the dog, thinking it might make it easier to move her, but her grip was surprisingly strong. Her fingers were locked around the little animal's body, white-knuckled and unyielding. She didn't speak, she didn't even make a sound. Her eyes, when they fluttered open for a moment, were glazed over, seeing nothing. Carefully he worked her free from the mud, pulling gently, trying not to hurt her. She felt impossibly light, like a bundle of sticks. He lifted her onto his horse, positioning her in front of him. Her small body slumped against his chest. The dead dog remained cradled in her arms. He held her steady, feeling the faint tremor of her breathing, then turned the horse and rode slowly back towards his ranch. It was a small weathered house, but it stood on high ground, well above the reach of any flood. Back at the cabin, he got a fire going in the hearth, the flames casting flickering shadows on the rough-hewn walls. He found a clean, old flannel shirt and some blankets. He managed to get a little clean water into her, spoonful by spoonful, but she wouldn't eat. She lay on the narrow cot near the fire, eyes fixed on the ceiling, the dead dog still pressed to her chest. He tried again, gently, to separate her from the animal, but she just tightened her grip, her knuckles white. She didn't speak, she didn't cry, just held the dog, as if it were a shield against everything that had happened. Finally, as the sun dipped low and the room filled with the smell of wood smoke, her grip loosened slightly. She had fallen into a shallow, fitful sleep. Rhett carefully, slowly, pulled the dog from her arms. It was stiff, heavy with mud. He wrapped it in an old sack, carried it outside, and buried it quietly behind the shed, near the overgrown patch of weeds. He used a shovel, the earth still soft and damp from the rain. When he came back inside, she was awake. She was sitting up on the cot, watching him. She had seen him bury the dog. Her gaze was steady, unwavering. She didn't say a word. The silence in the cabin stretched for days, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the lowing of the cattle outside. The girl moved like a ghost, taking the water he offered, picking at the food with thin fingers. She rarely met his gaze. He learned to leave her be, to simply place the things she needed within reach. He'd built a life around quiet, and she seemed to fit into it, albeit as a new, unexpected kind of quiet. On the third day, as the sun streamed through the window and dappled the floor, she was sitting on the porch step, watching a spider spin its web. Rhett came out with a bucket of feed for the chickens. He stopped, not wanting to disturb the fragile peace. Then, so soft he almost missed it, she whispered a single word. "May," he paused, then nodded. "May," he repeated, the name feeling strange on his tongue. He didn't ask anything else. He didn't ask where she'd come from, or if she had family. The questions hung in the air, unasked, unnecessary. She still hadn't offered a single detail about her life before the mud. He respected that. He left her there, watching the spider, and went to feed the birds. Later that afternoon, he rode into town for supplies. The general store was buzzing with news of the mudslide, the worst in living memory. The clerk, a man named Silas who always had his ear to the ground, mentioned the homestead at the western ridge. "The Millers," Silas said, shaking his head. "Lost the whole family. Heard the house just went. Everyone inside." He gave Rhett a pitying look. "Just a damn shame. No one left." Rhett listened, his gaze drifting to the stack of fresh newspapers by the counter. The headlines confirmed it. The Miller family, all gone. He knew then what he'd suspected. The girl May was alone. He bought his flour and coffee, the weight of the news settling heavy in his gut. He didn't tell her when he got back to the ranch. Not yet. She was still too frail, too much like a startled bird. He wanted her stronger before he gave her that kind of truth. That evening, as they sat across from each other at the small wooden table, the lamp casting a warm glow, May picked at her plate of beans and salt pork. Her eyes were downcast. Then, without looking up, she mumbled, "I don't want to go back." The words were so quiet, they were almost swallowed by the silence of the room. Rhett put down his fork. He looked at the girl, then at the flickering flame of the lamp. "Ain't nothing left to go back to," he said, his voice flat and steady. She didn't respond. She just sat there, her shoulders slumped, the plate untouched. May slowly, almost imperceptibly, started to find a rhythm within the rancher's quiet routine. She began with small tasks, unasked. She'd feed the chickens, scattering grain with a practiced hand Rhett hadn't expected. She swept the dust from the porch with an old broom, making careful, deliberate strokes. She even started hauling split wood from the pile by the shed, carrying surprisingly heavy armfuls into the house. She was quiet as she moved, almost silent, like a shadow in the corners of his vision. But what truly caught Rhett's attention was her habit of watching the sky. She would sit on the porch for long hours, sometimes with a cup of water, sometimes just with her hands clasped in her lap. Her gaze was always directed upwards, following the slow drift of clouds. She watched them like they were omens, like each billow and swirl held some secret message, a prediction for what was to come. He'd catch her staring, her eyes distant, as if trying to read an invisible script written across the vast blue expanse. She didn't smile, not once in all the weeks she'd been there, and she never cried. No tears spilled from those watchful eyes, not even when she spoke of the mudslide, or when the county paper confirmed her family's fate. There was a stillness to her, an absence of outward emotion that Rhett found unsettling. But she wasn't lost, not in the way some folks got after a shock. She was alert. Her eyes, though often distant, were sharp when they focused. Rhett started to notice little things. A particular way she'd tilt her head, listening to the wind before it picked up, or how she'd gather the laundry from the line just minutes before the first unexpected drop of rain. She seemed thoughtful, almost predictive, like she knew something was coming before it happened. It wasn't guesswork, it was a kind of quiet certainty. He'd be out in the barn, busy with a bridle, and he'd see her standing by the window, her silhouette framed against the afternoon light, just watching the horizon. He wondered what she was looking for, what she expected to see, or maybe what she expected to avoid. She saw things, he realized, that he didn't. Things in the sky, or perhaps things inside herself. One morning, as Rhett stepped onto his porch, ready to begin the day's chores, he stopped. Something was different. On the weathered floorboards, Tucked beside an old stack of newspapers sat a feed bucket. It was an old, dented thing he used for hauling grain, forgotten for weeks, but now it wasn't empty. Small, vibrant wildflowers, purple and yellow and brilliant red, poked out from a mound of fresh dirt. They looked wild and free, not like something from a cultivated garden. He glanced towards the window of the cabin, but May wasn't there. He bent down, touching a delicate petal. He hadn't seen her leave the ranch or come back with anything. He just stared at the bucket, a small, unexpected splash of color on his dull porch. May said nothing about it when she finally emerged, carrying an armful of split wood. She merely skirted the bucket, as if it had always been there. But then, every day afterward, another small pot appeared. Sometimes it was an old tin can, sometimes a chipped ceramic mug he hadn't seen in years. Each one held new blossoms, pulled from the hillsides, a patch of bluebonnets he'd seen growing by the creek bed, a cluster of delicate white bells he knew grew only on the north slope, a single fiery red Indian paintbrush, its petals like tiny flames. She was making color where there was none before, in quiet, scattered offerings. He didn't ask where she found them, or why she brought them. He just watched them appear. The porch began to change. What had once been a dumping ground for worn tools, dusty boots and empty feed sacks slowly transformed. The old things were nudged aside, replaced by the surprising bounty of the wildflowers. It became a place that drew the eye, a spot where light seemed to linger differently. It wasn't just a place for storage anymore. It was starting to feel like a sanctuary, a small, vibrant pocket of life on his otherwise stark and silent ranch. Each new bloom was a quiet defiance, a soft growing presence that filled the spaces he hadn't even known were empty. The sun was high when the dust plume appeared on the road, rising like a signal. Rhett was mending a loose hinge on the barn door when a man rode up, his horse a dusty grey. He was a stocky man with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. He dismounted, letting his gaze sweep over the ranch, lingering a moment too long on the cabin. "County man," he announced, his voice raspy, checking on storm damage, property lines, folks who might need a hand. Rhett nodded, his hand still on the hinge. "Damage is contained. Property lines are clear." He watched the man's eyes, which kept straying towards the open door of the cabin. May was inside, setting out fresh water. She had sensed his presence too. He felt the shift in the air, the sudden stillness from the cabin. The man stepped closer. "Heard a girl was found up here. That true?" His gaze sharpened, locking onto the cabin door. May emerged then, drawn by some invisible thread, or perhaps just curiosity. She held a bucket of water, her usual quiet posture. As the stranger spoke, she froze. Her body went rigid, her grip tightening on the bucket handle, until her knuckles turned white. She didn't look at him, but her whole form recoiled. It was subtle, barely a flinch, but Rhett saw it. The man smiled then, a slow, thin spreading of his lips that didn't reach his eyes. "Well now," he said, his voice dropping slightly. "Little thing, ain't she?" Rhett stepped between them, blocking May from the man's view. "She's fine. No trouble here." The stranger lingered for a few more minutes, asking about local cattle prices, his eyes still flickering past Rhett's shoulder. Finally he remounted, tipped his hat, and rode off. May hadn't moved until the sound of his horse's hooves faded completely. Later, checking the mailbox by the road, Rhett found a folded paper tucked beneath a pamphlet for cattle feed. It wasn't a county document. It was old, yellowed at the edges, a wanted poster. 2 years back. The face on it was a grim, hard-jawed man, with a description of his known associates and a history of violence. The name was unfamiliar, but the description of a runaway girl, age 15 at the time, was stark. A girl with dark hair, a small scar above her left eye. He looked at May's profile as she sat on the porch, arranging a new cluster of bright orange poppies. The faint white line above her left eyebrow caught the afternoon sun. He put the pieces together slowly. May wasn't just running from mud and water. She was escaping something much, much worse. The wanted poster sat on Rhett's kitchen table for a day, then 2, before he finally picked it up. He studied the hard lines of the man's face, the list of offences. The quiet truth of it weighed on him. He knew he had to talk to May. He found her by the creek, kneeling in the damp earth, gently pulling up small shoots of wildflowers. The sun was low, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. He approached her slowly, not wanting to startle her. She looked up, her gaze steady but wary. He held out the crumpled paper. "You want to tell me what happened?" he asked, his voice low, gentle. It wasn't an accusation, just a question. She took the paper from him, her fingers tracing the faded ink. She didn't flinch, didn't make a sound. She looked at the picture of the man, then slowly she began to talk. Her voice was barely a whisper at first, the words almost lost to the rustle of the leaves. She spoke of a father who was violent, unpredictable, of a life lived on the run, moving from one forgotten cabin to another, always just ahead of the law. She spoke of quiet cruelty, of fear that was a constant companion. The mudslide wasn't a tragedy, she said. Not for her. It was an escape. She didn't cry. Her eyes remained dry, distant, as she recounted years of a life lived on edge. She spoke with a detached quietness, as if narrating someone else's story. He was always saying I was bad luck, she said, her voice flat, almost devoid of feeling. I think I was supposed to die with the house. That's what he always said would happen if I ever left. She looked at the ground, then back at Rhett. Her gaze was direct now, clear. Rhett stood there, watching her. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deeper, darker hues. He didn't know what to say to words like that, to a truth so stark and unadorned. He just looked at her, at the small, resilient girl in front of him. You didn't, he said, his voice quiet but firm. You didn't die. She didn't respond, just turned her attention back to the earth, gently pressing a new shoot of green into the soil. He watched her for a moment longer, then walked back towards the cabin, leaving her there, under the darkening sky, quietly planting. He knew then that he would let her keep planting flowers, for as long as she wanted. It seemed important. It was a small act of defiance against all the things she had run from, all the things the storm had buried. News travelled slow in the Texas hill country, but it travelled deep, carried on the wind and whispered across fences. Before long, word had spread through town that Rhett Marlowe, the reclusive widower, had a girl up at the ranch. It wasn't phrased as a question, but a statement of fact, layered with unspoken meaning. Folks started to whisper in the general store, in the church pews, after Sunday service. Was she his? Was she a runaway? What in the name of common sense was a young girl doing living with a man who hadn't spoken more than 10 words to anyone outside of business in almost a decade? Rhett felt the eyes on him when he rode into town for supplies. The murmurs would stop when he entered a room, only to pick up again the moment he turned his back. He heard snatches of conversation, half-sentences about propriety and what folks will think. It was the kind of judgment that didn't need to be spoken outright. It hung in the air, thick as summer dust. He ignored it, bought his feed, and rode back, his jaw tight. May went into town only once after the mudslide. Rhett needed to pick up some medicine, and she wanted to see the post office. Maybe send a letter, though she never said to whom. He told her to wait by the wagon while he went inside. As he came out, he saw her, standing a little too close to the edge of the boardwalk. A woman with a pinched face and a tightly laced bonnet walked past, paused and looked May up and down. Rhett watched as the woman leaned in to her companion, her voice a low, hissing whisper that still carried on the quiet street. Looks feral, the woman said, her gaze dismissive and sharp, like a stray cat. May didn't react outwardly. She didn't move, didn't flinch, but her shoulders pulled inward, just a fraction. Her eyes, usually so watchful, became dull, opaque. She didn't look at the woman, but Rhett saw the way her hand tightened into a small fist at her side. She stood there, frozen, until the women had passed. From that day on, May stopped leaving the ranch altogether. She wouldn't ride with him into town, no matter how he suggested it. She stayed within the boundaries of his property, moving through the fields and along the creek bed, always keeping the cabin in sight. The world outside the ranch, the world that judged and whispered, was not a place she wanted to revisit. She had found a small, fragile peace in the quiet space Rhett had given her, and she clung to it, retreating from the disapproving eyes of the town. The small pots of wildflowers continued to appear on the porch, a growing collection of vibrant defiance against the weathered wood. But some of the older pots were starting to crack, and the plants were getting too big for their cramped containers. Rhett watched May carefully transplant a wilting purple blossom into a slightly larger tin, her brow furrowed in concentration. He didn't say anything about it, not at first. One afternoon, he found himself outside with a hammer and some salvaged lumber. He started building an actual flower box, long and shallow, running along the edge of the porch railing. He cut the wood carefully, planed the rough edges, and nailed it together with precise, quiet movements. May watched him from the porch swing, her head tilted slightly, saying nothing. When he was done, he filled it with fresh soil he'd dug from the creek bed. "Here," he said, gesturing to the box. "Room for more." She looked at the box, then at him, a flicker of something he couldn't quite name in her eyes. Then, slowly, she started moving her pots. He helped her, carefully lifting the more delicate ones, guiding her hands as she gently loosened the roots from their old homes. She spent whole afternoons kneeling by the box, arranging petals, vines, and desert poppies. Her fingers, though thin, were surprisingly strong and deft as she coaxed the plants into their new beds. She talked to them sometimes, soft murmurs he couldn't quite hear, but he saw the way her lips moved, the gentle tilt of her head. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in streaks of orange and deep violet, she sat back on her heels, wiping a smudge of dirt from her cheek. She looked out at the vast, empty land stretching out before them. "I don't know how to be anything but broken," she said, her voice thin, almost a sigh. The words hung in the quiet air, a stark admission. Rhett was sitting on the top step, cleaning his boots with a rag. He paused, looking at her, then at the bright array of flowers now blooming vibrantly in the new box. He thought of all the years he'd spent alone, all the things that had felt broken inside him too. "You grow things," he said, his voice low and steady. He tapped the newly planted box with the toe of his boot. "That don't sound broken to me." She didn't reply, but he saw the slightest softening around her eyes, a tiny, almost imperceptible shift. She just turned back to her flowers, her hands moving gently among the petals. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, carried by the dusty mail rider who came twice a week. It bore the seal of the state capital, Austin, and the return address of a government office. Rhett opened it with a feeling of unease. He usually only got bills or cattle notices. This was different. He read it slowly, his brow furrowing deeper with each line. The state had discovered that May had survived the mudslide. They had located distant relatives, a family in a small town 2 days' ride north, and intended to place her in their custody. The letter spoke of proper guardianship and a stable environment. It spoke of a plan to collect her within the month. His hands tightened on the paper. He showed it to May that evening. Her face, usually so still, paled. She read the official language, her eyes wide, then looked up at him, a tremor running through her body. It wasn't the kind of terror that made a sound. It was a deep, internal shudder. She wasn't afraid of being taken in, he realized. She was terrified of being lost again, of having the fragile peace she'd built here shattered, of being tossed into another unknown place. "They'll make me start over," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her hands gripped the edges of the letter, crumpling the paper. I can't do it again." She looked around the small cabin, at the familiar walls, at the newly blooming flowers on the porch visible through the window. It was as if she was seeing it all for the first time, or perhaps for the last. Rhett stared at the fire crackling in the hearth for a long time, the words of the letter burning in his mind. He thought of the long years of his own quiet solitude, and then of the slow, unexpected filling of that silence since May had arrived. He thought of the wild flowers, the quiet meals, the steady presence she had become. The words of the town, the whispers, the veiled accusations swam in his head. But then he looked at May, her face tight with a fear he understood. He looked at the fragile peace she had found, and the simple truth of what had grown between them. He took a deep breath. "You're not going anywhere," he said, the words quiet but hard as flint. He folded the letter and tossed it into the flames. The next morning, Rhett rode into town, the memory of May's pale face sharp in his mind. He went straight to the sheriff's office, a small, dusty room smelling of stale coffee and old paper. Sheriff Brody, a portly man with a perpetually tired expression, listened to Rhett's story, then shook his head. "State's got their own ways, Rhett. Ain't much I can do. Paperwork's all legal and proper." He shrugged, dismissing the matter. He seemed more concerned with the dust on his boots than the fate of a young girl. Next, Rhett sought out Judge Harrison, a stern-faced man who prided himself on upholding the law. The judge listened with a practiced neutrality, his fingers steepled under his chin. "A delicate matter, Mr. Marlowe," he said, his voice dry. "We're looking into it. Distant relatives, you say. The law favors family, even distant ones." He offered no real help, no path forward. The doors were closing, one by one. Behind closed doors, the whispers continued, louder now. Rhett felt the chill of it, the thinly veiled accusations. He walked past the general store and heard fragments of conversation float out into the street. "He's trying to hide a runaway, I tell you," one man murmured, his voice low but sharp. Another chimed in. "It ain't right, a man like him, living alone with a young girl. There's gossip." The words felt like stones thrown at his back. They didn't care about May. They didn't care about her past or the life she was trying to build. They only cared about their own narrow ideas of what was proper. That night, back on the ranch, May sat on the porch, her small frame hunched. The last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, leaving the world in shades of grey. She didn't ask about the town, but she knew. She always knew. "They don't care that I lived," she said, her voice flat, devoid of any hope. "They just care that I'm here." She looked out at the vast, darkening landscape, as if seeing the indifference of the world reflected in the distant hills. Rhett didn't have an answer for that. He just sat beside her, the porch planks creaking under his weight, watching the last of the light disappear. Rhett didn't talk about it much, which was his way. Instead, he simply acted. The next morning, he rode out early, taking the long, dusty trail to the county seat, a town larger than his own, with a proper courthouse. He found a lawyer there, a sharp-faced woman named Mrs. Calhoun, who listened to his blunt explanation of the situation. She quoted him a price, a sum that made his stomach clench. It would take most of the earnings from his last cattle sale, almost everything he had saved. He didn't hesitate. He paid her with a stack of worn bills, watching them disappear into her hand. He filed the guardianship papers, quietly. No fanfare, no announcements, just the scratch of a pen on thick paper, the quiet hum of the lawyer's office. He explained May's situation, her history, the danger she'd fled. He made it clear he wasn't family, but that he was offering a home, a safe place. Mrs. Calhoun worked fast, pushing the papers through the channels, arguing the case of a minor in need of protection, a survivor of a natural disaster with no other recourse. It was a gamble, a long shot, but it was the only shot he had. On the way home he stopped in a small mercantile he hadn't visited before, one outside of his usual town. He bought a box of old dresses, sturdy cotton and faded calico, things that looked like they might fit a girl May's size. And he bought a handful of seed packets, daisies, desert lilies, and something called forget-me-nots. He paid cash, leaving only a few coins in his pocket. Back at the ranch, he placed the box of clothes on May's bed. She looked at the dresses, then at the seed packets, her gaze lingering on the colourful pictures of flowers. She didn't say much, just nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture of acceptance. Later that afternoon, he saw her out by the shed, near the patch of earth where the dog was buried. She knelt, her fingers carefully tearing open one of the seed packets. It was the forget-me-nots. She dug a small hole with a broken twig and carefully sprinkled the tiny seeds into the damp soil. Then she covered them, patting the earth gently. It was a silent conversation, a promise of remembrance, and a quiet act of hope, planted right where the last of her past still lay buried. That spring, the ranch porch exploded with colour. It wasn't just a few pots anymore, it was a riot of life. The flower box Rhett had built was overflowing with vibrant blooms. Purple passion vines snaked up the porch posts, tiny white daisies dotted the edges, and brilliant desert lilies unfolded their petals in the warm sun. May's careful work, her quiet dedication, had transformed the plain, weathered wood into a living canvas. It smelled of earth and pollen and sunshine, a scent that now mingled with the familiar smell of dust and leather. Passers-by, usually only seeing Rhett as a distant, solitary figure on his land, started to notice. First they whispered, their wagons slowing slightly as they drove past, heads turning towards the unexpected burst of colour. Then, a few days later, a wave, a cautious nod from a rider. The whispers didn't stop entirely, but a new kind of curiosity had begun to mix with the old suspicion. The porch wasn't just a curiosity, it was beautiful. A widow from town, known for her sharp tongue, drove by one afternoon. A week later she pulled up in her buggy, a basket of freshly canned peaches and jellies on her lap. She didn't say much, just set the jars on the porch step, nodded at May, and drove away. Another day, the schoolteacher, a bookish woman with spectacles, stopped and left a worn copy of a book of pressed flowers. Small, quiet offerings, delivered without expectation. May, for her part, slowly bloomed too. She still didn't talk much, but her shoulders were less hunched. Her eyes, though still watchful, held a softer light. One warm afternoon, a child, no older than 5, wandered off the road and stood transfixed by the vibrant porch, his eyes wide with wonder. May looked at the child, and a faint smile, the first Rhett had ever seen, touched her lips. It was small, hesitant, but it was there. She knelt down, her hands covered in rich soil. "Would you like to learn how to plant?" she asked, her voice soft, inviting. The child nodded, eyes still fixed on the blooming porch. It was the beginning of something new. Years passed on the ranch, marked not by calendars but by the steady rhythm of the seasons. Rhett got greyer around the temples, the lines around his eyes deepening from years of looking out at the wide, bright land. His shoulders, though still broad, carried a bit more weight than they used to. May, for her part, got taller, stronger. The thin girl who had clutched a dead dog to her chest became a woman, her movements graceful and assured. Her dark hair, once plastered with mud, was now often braided, shimmering in the sun. She never left, not for good. She visited town sometimes, now for supplies or to pick up fabric. Her presence no longer drawing whispers, but quiet nods of recognition. The children she had first invited to learn how to garden grew up, and new ones came, their small hands eager to dig in the dirt. They called her Miss May, a title of respect, of belonging. No one in town asked how she got there anymore. The old rumours faded, replaced by the simple, undeniable truth of her presence, of the beauty she cultivated. Rhett, in his quiet way, continued to build things. One winter, when the ground was too hard for planting, he spent weeks constructing a greenhouse with his bare hands. It was a simple structure of rough-hewn timber and salvaged glass panes, but it kept the flowers alive through the cold months, a testament to his unspoken devotion. He watched her work inside it, her face glowing in the soft filtered light, surrounded by green. They ate dinner on the porch most nights, even when the air was crisp. The flower beds now sprawled beyond the porch, a vast tapestry of colour that crept towards the barn and the creek. The air hummed with the sound of bees. There was still a quietness between them, a comfort born of shared understanding that didn't need many words. Sometimes the only sound was the rustle of leaves and the distant lowing of a cow. The house that had once held only silence now felt full, alive, surrounded by colour and the quiet hum of growing things. It was a warm evening, the kind that smelled of damp earth and late-blooming jasmine. Rhett and May sat on the porch swing, the wood creaking softly under their combined weight. Years had etched themselves onto their faces, but there was a settled peace about them now, a quiet contentment. The flowers in full bloom were a vibrant, breathing presence around them, a testament to seasons of growth and steady care. The desert lilies glowed like lanterns in the fading light. Rhett looked out at the familiar landscape, the rounded hills stretching towards the horizon, purple against the setting sun. He thought of that day, all those years ago, the mud, the hand sticking out from the wreckage. He hadn't been looking for anything but a cleared trail. "I never meant to find you," Rhett said, his voice a low rumble, breaking the comfortable silence. He leaned back against the swing, his eyes on the distant line of trees. It was a simple truth, a statement of fact, not regret. May turned her head, looking at him. Her eyes held that quiet wisdom, that knowingness she had always carried. A faint smile touched her lips, soft as the evening breeze. "You didn't," she replied, her voice gentle. "The hill did." She reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against a drooping cluster of purple flowers that spilled over the edge of the porch box. The last light of day faded, leaving the world bathed in the deep indigo of twilight. The camera slowly panned out from the porch, drawing back from the quiet figures. It moved past the vibrant flower beds, their colours muted now in the dim light, over the small unassuming mound of earth behind the shed where the dog's grave lay, marked by a scattering of forget-me-nots. It swept across the house, which had once held only the vast, echoing silence of a lonely man, now alive with the subtle hum of a life carefully cultivated. Sometimes the land takes everything. It sweeps away homes, claims lives, and leaves nothing but wreckage in its wake. And sometimes, if you're quiet enough, if you're willing to tend to what's left, even when it seems like nothing at all, it gives something back.